for November 2018. I'm Ann Zimmerman. I'm the Vice President of the League of Women Voters of Salina. Let me say first that the League of Women Voters is a not-for-profit, nonpartisan organization of women and men of every race and age and background and political belief. We have 1,200 local leagues across the country and state leagues and the national organization, and we work to promote citizen action on local, state, and national issues, and to make sure that the right to vote is allowed for all citizens who are eligible to do so. Today we have cookies and coffee for those of you. Stout coffee, let me say. So you're welcome to get that at any time, and if you brought your lunch, you're welcome to eat it here. And we hope that once you finish eating, you'll think about questions to ask. Our topic today is DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. The speaker is Karen Couch. She works for Catholic Charities in Salina, which is called what? Catholic Charities of Northern Kansas, yes. She grew up in Southern California. She moved to Kansas to go to Washburn Law School, and she graduated with honors from there, moved to Salina to practice law, and she's been working with Catholic Charities since early 2017. So please welcome Karen Couch.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here, and I wanted to share just a tad bit about what Catholic Charities does. Our mission is to help reduce poverty among the vulnerable, and that's regardless of religion. We are a separate 501c3 organization, but certainly our programs and services reflect the Catholic values, but we are open to anyone of any creed, religion, or persuasion. So immigration has been a big part of Catholic Charities for a number of years. Here in Salina, it's been about 25 years of immigration services that started actually with the Sisters of St. Joseph up in Concordia. They started the call to assist with refugees and asylees, and it's trickled down into a Catholic Charities program. Here, because I'm the head of the immigration department, I joined in January of 2017. And deferred action is something that I've dealt with since I started immigration, and I actually started doing immigration during private practice, not as much as I'm doing today. I'm just completely focused on immigration today. But it is something that's been around since 2012, and we're going to talk about some of the nuts and bolts of immigration, including DACA. So I called it Diving into DACA, but I don't have very many terms or references to swimming or anything like that, so don't worry about it. Not too corny. Our agenda, we're going to cover what is DACA, as well as how it was created, why does it matter, and where are we today. So jumping right in, what is DACA? As Ann said, it's Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. It is a program that defers action, which is a fancy way of saying prosecutorial discretion, which is another fancy way of saying we're not going to deport you, we're going to hold off on that for right now and let you still stay in the United States. Just as a general overview of immigration, our immigration system here in the United States is based upon permission. If you aren't a U.S. citizen, whether that's by birth or by naturalization, if you're not a U.S. citizen, you have to have permission. That's how our laws work. That's what's on our books. It says you have to request permission. And so for those that don't have permission, then they have violated a law, and that puts them at risk of being removed from the country, sometimes referred to as deportation. And so deferred action is saying that we're not going to remove you right now. It's not saying we're never going to remove you. It's just we're not removing you right now. For childhood arrivals refers to individuals who came before they turned 18 into the United States probably because they were either brought by a family member or their circumstances caused them to flee and somehow end up in the United States. So there are qualifications for applying for deferred action, and that includes someone who came to the United States before they turned 16. Also, they have to be under the age of 31 by the time they initially applied for DACA, as well as they have to prove that they've been residing in the United States since June 15th of 2007. They also have to prove that they've been physically present in the United States as of January 15th, 2012, and at the time that they initially applied for DACA. There further is a requirement that they have to pursue education. And so most of my DACA recipients applied just after turning 15, and they had to demonstrate that they were currently in high school or in the education system or had obtained a GED. The other requirement is if they were honorably discharged as a veteran, that could take away the education requirement. But those are the general requirements for when someone wanted to apply for DACA the first time around. There are also things that can disqualify someone from getting DACA. Those include conviction of a felony, conviction of a significant misdemeanor, conviction of 3 or more other misdemeanors, or they pose a threat to national security. Conviction is important. The term conviction or convicted in the immigration world is a much broader concept than in an attorney for a criminal case. That kind of conviction for immigration could be just the fact that they pled no contest or they entered into a diversion agreement where they agreed, they stipulated to the fact that they committed the elements of the crime even though they haven't necessarily pled to the crime. So the term conviction is much broader. You'll also note there is significant misdemeanor. What does that mean? Well, there's nothing in any state's laws that I've been able to find that defines something as a significant misdemeanor. It just doesn't exist. A misdemeanor is a misdemeanor, a felony is a felony. But again, in the immigration world, a significant misdemeanor is a relationship to the underlying character of the person who committed the crime. So, for instance, if you commit a DUI, the first time DUI here in Kansas is a misdemeanor offense. However, because it's drug or alcohol related, it falls into the category of significant misdemeanor. So, a lot of my DACA recipients have to be extremely careful, especially when they turn 21 or about to turn 21. I encourage them not to go party because if they get a DUI and they don't get a diversion, they will have a conviction for a significant misdemeanor and no longer be able to get DACA. This is the pathway of someone who wants to apply for deferred action. So our graphic shows a person. Thank you, Ian.
That's right.
That's right. Our person shows that they actually have to start by documenting that they meet those requirements. Remember, it's continuous presence, residency as of certain ages. And so basically we end up with like a booklet about this thick with education records, with medical records, with phone bills, with leases, with any kind of documentation. If they were ever in a special activity or received an award, I want to see that because I actually have a duty to try to document their continuous residence, which means pretty much every 2 or 3 months, I have to have a piece of paper that proves you're here. And so we have to come up with a big stack of supporting documentation. That's the first step. Once you have that supporting documentation and you can evaluate that they're going to be a good candidate for this, then they have to complete certain forms. I've listed the forms there. It's the I-821D, the I-765, the I-765 worksheet. Basically, if you know anything about our federal government, they like numbers and letters, and they put them together in combinations and they spout them out like it's some kind of foreign language. And so those forms pertain to deferred action, and we fill out those forms and then we submit them. Of course, we couldn't do this for free. We have to submit them with a filing fee. On the slide, this says $465 is the filing fee. It's actually $495 right now. It increases at USCIS, which is U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is the immigration paper pushers of the Department of Homeland Security. They're the ones that get all these applications and forms, and they choose what the filing fee is. So right now it's $495. And we send that all to a lockbox. That means it's a post office box for the federal government. They receive that, they make sure I've signed the forms, the client signed the forms, the filing fee is there, and then they send it on to one of their many service centers around the globe, who then are the people at the desk looking through the application to verify the person meets the requirements, and then they make the decision whether or not to decide to give them deferred action. It's not a guarantee. For even some of the clients that I think meet those requirements, or I believe wholeheartedly they meet those requirements, it is a discretionary decision. So it's supposed to be a case by case. More often than not, it's pretty easy to get DACA as long as you don't have the felony, the misdemeanor, and so forth. But it is still supposed to be discretionary. Then, before they get the ultimate decision whether they've been granted DACA, they do have to go get their fingerprints taken. That's called a biometrics appointment, and that's at one of the nearest USCIS field offices, which would either be Wichita if you live in Junction City, farther to the west of our state, or it would be in Kansas City if you live in Manhattan and any further east. Then, of course, hopefully they get a decision from Homeland Security that says they have been deferred action. And so what does that actually mean? Well, it doesn't provide them permission to be in the United States. All it does is it stops them from being deported for a period of time. And that period of time is 2 years. So for 2 years, they kind of have bubble wrap around them, provided they don't break the law or do anything where the government could step in and say, you've now violated the terms of DACA. During that 2-year period, they are allowed to apply for an employment authorization card. That's a card that's going to allow them to work lawfully in the United States, because employers are supposed to ask for verification that they can work here. And so this EAD card will only be good for 2 years, the period that their DACA is valid. Once you have your employment authorization card, you can go down to the Social Security Administration and ask for a Social Security number, which allows you to work. Because then, of course, you can tie your pay to your Social Security number and pay your taxes. And that card will have the words written on it, valid for work only with DHS authorization, which would indicate to the employer that, yeah, there's probably a deadline when they're not going to be valid anymore to work. So I need to monitor their time period for DACA. Once you have a Social Security card and an employment authorization card, you can then get a driver's license. Again, your driver's license is tied to your DACA and it's tied to your Social Security number, so it's only good for the period of 2 years while you have DACA. That poses a problem because what happens at the end of those 2 years? Well, if you haven't renewed your DACA, then the client has to officially stop working. They don't have authority to work anymore. They have to stop driving. They don't have a license to drive anymore. They can't report any income on their Social Security number anymore. So what happens when they want to renew? Well, before September of 2017, when you went to renew, it was taking 9 to 11 months for Homeland Security to process that application. But the application instructions for their DACA renewal say you can only file this within 150 days of your card expiring, which for some DACA recipients to go for a period of time without the ability to drive and without the ability to work. Some of them got lucky and it matched, and so they were able to have a seamless employment and seamless ability to drive. But each DACA request is actually a separate request, and so they're not just going to renew you from the date that your last DACA expired. Ouch. And again, of course, you have to pay the filing fee, and you have to prove all the requirements other than the education requirement. There is a section that you don't have to provide information on, and that's education or military service once you've already received DACA one time.
Karen, so is the filing fee the same for renewal as for education?
It is. It's the same exact forms, same exact process. $495. It was $465, but $495. So, how was DACA created? I'm going to start with telling you the facts of June 15th, 2012, which is a date on which that the then acting Homeland Security Secretary, which was Janet Napolitano, issued a memorandum that was entitled Exercising Prosecutorial Discretion with Respect to Individuals Who Came to the United States as Children. This happened in the morning of June 15th. Then later that afternoon, President Obama was in the Rose Garden and had a press conference in where he approved that executive branch memorandum and encouraged Congress to pass the DREAM Act. The DREAM Act is not DACA, and I know sometimes we refer to recipients of DACA as dreamers, and that's totally fine, but they were separate things. The DREAM Act actually stands for Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors. It was an attempt to qualify some minors who were undocumented without permission here in the United States for a status called conditional permanent residency, conditional residency, if they met certain qualifications. And it was slightly different qualifications than what DACA turned out to be. It was having a character that was good, having certain age requirements and residency requirements that are slightly different than what DACA is. But the nice thing about the DREAM Act is it didn't just leave them in this conditional residency state. It actually gave them a path to lawful permanent residency, which if you become a lawful permanent residency, you have a pathway then to eventually citizenship. Again, DACA doesn't do that. But the DREAM Act had originally been introduced in Congress in 2001, and it was unsuccessful, and it was reintroduced multiple times in 2007, 2010, and then 2011, right before this June 15, 2012 day, where we received this memorandum from Homeland Security saying they are going to exercise prosecutorial discretion, which became known as DACA. Okay, so I'm setting this up. Then I do want to also mention that this is what President Obama said in his speech about DACA, that this is not intended to be an amnesty. It's not immunity. It's not a path to citizenship. It's not a permanent fix. It's a temporary stopgap measure that lets us focus our resources wisely while giving a degree of relief and hope to talented, driven, patriotic young people. The reason I read that is because I think it's important to see that we've gone from a time period when Congress was trying to enact through the legislative process a law that was going to do something for these young adults. And when that was turning out to be somewhat unsuccessful, then we had a president that came in and through a memorandum, or affirming a memorandum, made the DACA program. It plays into why it's controversial, because there's this debate of who has authority to make laws. Is DACA a law, or is it a temporary fix? So the debate goes on. The one thing that you'll find if you were to Google DACA is you'll see different articles referring referring to it as either executive action or executive order. And frankly, before I got into immigration, I would say, what's the difference? Does it matter? The difference is important. Executive action is actually an informal proposal. It's any time that the president says, I'm encouraging Congress or I'm encouraging my cabinet to do X, Y, and Z. It's encouragement, and sometimes that encouragement actually can set a policy, but more often than not, it's simply encouragement. An executive order, on the other hand, is an actual directive. It's an actual order coming down from his constitutional powers with full force and effect of law, as long as it abides to the terms of the Constitution. Both executive action and executive orders can be trumped by, no pun intended, trumped by court systems, so by lawsuits, and also undone by legislative action. So if you were to press the issue, is it really DACA, is it really an executive action or an executive order? I'd probably have to say the best approach is the one that really doesn't answer the question, which is, let's just say it's a non-congressionally authorized administrative program or policy, because that really doesn't, it's still in limbo land. Either way, I think the important thing to know is, what does that mean and why does that matter? And that goes on to the next slide. Well, I think it matters to know about DACA because it has an impact for our state in particular and across our country. In Kansas, DACA has allowed more than 6,800 young people receive work authorization and driver's licenses. And bear in mind that because they're childhood arrivals, more likely than not, their parents are also undocumented, so they may be the only driver. They may be the only legal worker within their family unit. Across the country, we've had nearly 800,000 individuals receive DACA. In Kansas, DACA recipients make up about 5,900 workers. So almost all of them, about 1,000 short, are not working, and that might be because they're still too young to work. They're still probably pursuing full-time education, but a majority of them have at least one job. And across the U.S., about 685,000 of DACA recipients are in our labor pool. So the economic impact on that is that if DACA ends, it would cost Kansas more than $335.9 million in annual GDP losses, and across our country, that would be $460.3 billion from the national GDP over the next 10 years. So there is a significant economic impact if DACA were to completely disappear. There's also a significant economic impact if we created a permanent solution for these young adults. On the other hand, we do have to recognize that because DACA doesn't provide any legal permission or status here in the United States, these young adults, if they remain on DACA, are inherently deportable, which means they can be removed from the country after their DACA period expires, because DACA doesn't fix that. Also, these are young adults who weren't necessarily on the radar. I mean, they weren't being reported by our public school systems, and they likely didn't have jobs that were above board. So even if they were in our community, they probably were under the radar. But now that they have filed for DACA, they have put their information out there. You do have to provide addresses, phone numbers, parents' information, entry day information, identifying biographic information. So that's one concern with DACA. Also, I've seen a lot of commentary that DACA is just a short-term band-aid to a much larger immigration problem. I don't want to get too political, but I think anytime that laws have been on the books and not reevaluated for a number of years, it can not be necessarily the best solution for the nation. And so I would suggest that immigration needs a reform. I'm not ashamed to say that. So that's kind of why it matters, because it is a short-term fix to the bigger problem. So where are we now? If I had to phrase it, I would say we're at the litigation marathon and the legislative standstill. So we're kind of stop and go. I tell my clients not to stop breathing, not to fear, not to worry, but keep their eyes and ears open, because it is a constantly changing world in immigration. I would bore you with a lot of details if I went into every single case and controversy that remains with DACA. But I'll suffice to say that the ability to defer action, this prosecutorial discretion, which is the underlying basis of DACA, is grounded on the notion that law enforcement does not have the manpower or resources to catch every single criminal. And so they have to allocate their resources in an efficient and efficient way. And so I might be the car that gets stopped and pulled over for speeding on I-70, and it might feel unfair to me, but I know that they can't catch every single car that's ever sped on I-70. The counter argument to DACA is, when you look at the number of recipients, it kind of looks like a blanket reprieve for a temporary period of time. Also, when you look at the memo from the Homeland Security Secretary, there was no time frame of when this period for the DACA program was going to end. Even though DACA is individually given for only a period of 2 years, it can be renewed multiple times so long as the program exists. And there was no end date to the program. So is this really then prosecutorial discretion, or is this more like a blanket amnesty or reprieve? So that's the debate that led to a lot of litigation. And that litigation kind of started because in November of 2014, the following Secretary of Homeland Security, Secretary Johnson, directed U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services to establish a similar program, but for the parents of U.S. citizens or U.S. permanent residents. And that was called DAPA, D-A-P-A, Deferred Action for Parents of Americans or Lawful Permanent Residents. The DAPA program was again designed to basically help the parents of the children that maybe were born here or brought here and got status. This memo also, at the same time it was going to create DAPA, was going to expand DACA by encompassing a wider range of young adults, increasing the age for which they can apply for DACA. Remember, DACA was limited. You had to be under 31 to initially apply. They were going to increase that. And also they were going to widen the arrival dates. So it was going to be a much larger pool that could potentially apply for DACA. 26 states challenged that action in the U.S. federal court system. And it actually was a case that was heard in the U.S. District Court of the Southern District of Texas. It's known as the Texas cases. And the federal judge there basically enjoined, which is a fancy way of saying, made an order that prevented the policy from moving forward, that said they were not successful, they were not likely to be successful in getting DAPA and this expansive DACA program through the court system because it violated the Administrative Procedures Act, which requires that laws normally have to be made to the public, available. There's got to be a notice and a comment period before they become established rules. So the Court of Appeals took that decision from the federal court to stop the DAPA and the expansion of DACA and heard that case. They affirmed the federal court, district court on that. It actually went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court also had an equally divided court on that, but it basically couldn't overcome the fact that this injunction exists. So this injunction prevented DAPA and prevented the expansion of DACA, which set it up then for states to continue to question, well, if they're going to get rid of, if we can't enforce DAPA and DACA through a memorandum by the Secretary of Homeland Security, how can we let DACA exist? Isn't that going to be the same flaw that ends the DACA program? And so that's where the legislation, the litigation has gone. Is there a question? Sorry. Okay, so in September of 2017, now former Attorney General Sessions sent a letter to the Department of Homeland Security basically saying, for the same reasons that DAPA and the expanded DACA program had to be terminated, or was put again in that injunction, then we need to stop and end DACA program. And so it was announced that DACA was not going to exist after September 5th of 2017. What they were going to do is say, no new first-time applicants. You can't file if you haven't requested it before. Then we're going to give you 1 month for those who are currently on DACA or have received DACA in the past. You have 1 month to try to renew your DACA one last time if you have to renew within a certain time period. So after that, we thought DACA would disappear unless the legislation was enacted to make some permanent solution. So we really had a mad rush for about a month of DACA recipients coming in and trying to renew. In that period of time, the post office actually failed to deliver quite a few DACA renewal applications, and they got delivered after the magic date of October 5th. Fortunately, the Post Office General acknowledged the error, and Homeland Security acknowledged the error and gave a second opportunity for those DACA recipients affected by that delay to resubmit their DACA renewals. I was kind of surprised. We actually had one of those cases, and we were successful, but it was 7 months, I think, from when he originally submitted it to when he actually got his renewal approved. He went without the driver's license and a work authorization. So after October, we thought DACA was dead, but then I should have known the court systems would kick in, and sure enough, there has been a case. It's called the Regents of the University of California versus Homeland Security in the Northern District of California, where they basically said, the way that they ended DACA program actually violated the Administrative Procedures Act, which is kind of ironic. And so that federal judge said, well, now I'm going to make an injunction that forces Homeland Security to keep accepting renewal applications. Now, it doesn't mean they're always going to grant your renewal application, but as of January of 2018, we could start filing renewal applications. That has been appealed to the Ninth Circuit, and actually I think it was just last week the Ninth Circuit affirmed that injunction, and so we're looking at going to the Supreme Court on that issue. Same time frame, there was a case in the Eastern District of New York, in the federal court system there, that basically makes that same kind of case, and the Eastern District of New York also created a likewise injunction. So there's 2 injunctions that are currently operating, allowing us to do DACA renewals right now. To complicate matters further, the same court that heard the DAPA and the expansion of DACA program and decided those violated the Administrative Procedures Act, and then said that they couldn't move forward with that, is now hearing another case, now this time on DACA, challenging it. And so far, the states in that case have filed for a preliminary injunction. The judge actually decided not to block DACA at that point, but because the interest weighed in favor of the DACA applicants. But the judge stayed his order to provide opportunities for the parties to do an interlocutory appeal with the Fifth Circuit. And so we're kind of waiting to see where that goes. There's also 2 other cases, one in Maryland and Washington, D.C. What this is basically leading up to is the Supreme Court. Someone's got to make a decision what's going to happen with DACA. And so that's what my clients are. We're both simultaneously waiting for a decision, but we're also hoping that it lasts for a long time so we can get as many renewals in as possible. I will say on a personal note that the numbers of DACA recipients has gone down because there's just an overwhelming amount of fear to continue to try to renew. And we've seen that in our clientele. There's just not as much DACA work coming out. That's really what I have for today on DACA. That's where we are right now. Those are the available options. It's purposely illegible because if you've ever seen the tax code, I think the immigration laws are just as bad. It's a nightmare. I spend a lot of my time with clients trying to go through a much more simplified flow chart that doesn't give every single option and scenario, but hopefully gives them a better idea of where our immigration laws come from, as well as sometimes I spend an entire hour walking through, how many pages was it? 7 pages of the U.S. immigration laws that we have, and looking at the influences in our laws. It's wars, it's labor shortages, it's racial disparities. I mean, there's a variety of influencers that have impacted our immigration history. And so it is really that complicated, and it's really that frustrating for a lot of our clients. But our goal at Catholic Charities is to educate. You can't possibly know what your options are or pursue options if they become available unless you know what status you're in and what to be on the lookout for. So with that, I will open it up for questions.
It seems to me like it would behoove us to the government to approve DACA forever just because of the money they take in. I mean, that's crass motive. But when you think $500 every 2 years from 800,000 people, that's a lot of money. Besides working and paying taxes.
Well, and I agree with you. I think one thing I have a tough time telling clients or relaying to clients sometimes is the fact that USCIS, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is the paper immigration pushers for Homeland Security, they operate solely on fees. So if they can charge you a fee, they will. And they will make you come back. Even if you're a permanent resident, they're going to make your card expire so that you come back and pay another fee. So their system is designed to feed themselves. Is that a good system? I'm not here to tell you one way or another.
The other thing is the number that you said are working in Kansas.
Mm-hmm.
We need workers. We need workers, librarians. I mean, all these professions, and that's what these kids, I call them kids, are doing.
Well, I hope some of you maybe attended the learning lecture at the museum, that happened earlier this year with a K-State professor, and he explained the rise and fall of immigration in the United States, and specifically Kansas. But I'm getting this from him, so I'm blaming it all on him. But that, you know, we had a negative population. Our death rate was more than our birth rates. So without immigrants to fill those gaps, you worry about the future of our state. And so it's time, I think it's personally time for our country to assess what our true needs are. Yes?
How are I just recently read that work visas in agriculture are way up. A lot of people are doing that. How is that impacting DACA?
Work agricultural visas are a non-immigrant visa. So visa is the fancy word for permission. You either have permission or you don't. And the way you show you have permission when you want to come to the United States is a visa. And there's two types. There's the non-immigrant, which is when someone's asking permission to come for a limited duration and a limited purpose. A immigrant visa is when someone's coming for a permanent reason. They want to make the United States their home, live, work, reside there. So the agricultural worker visa, I believe, is a non-immigrant visa because they're coming just for the harvest, or they're coming just for the period of time that they work in the fields. It is not giving them authorization to stay here permanently. So when someone is lucky enough to get an agricultural visa, there is a temptation to maybe stay because they know that if they want to get that very highly sought after immigrant visa, depending on which country they're from and whether a relative is petitioning for them, they may be looking at a 50, 40-year plan before they can ever secure that. So when your system induces disobedience, perhaps you need to look at your system.
Indeed, I'm in a position of being I'm languishing as an immigrant in between applying for re-upping, and I'm hanging in between, and I've got nothing to show. If law enforcement would intercept me, what would be the process? Could they in fact ship me out of the country immediately? And if that would happen in this line, or how would that work?
Okay, so any time that someone is without that permission, whether they originally had the permission and it expired and they stayed, or they just simply never had permission in the first place, they are subject to the grounds of deportability because immigration violations do subject you to removal from the United States. Depending on how long they have been in the United States, it may differ the process in which it takes to get them out. It is a court process. Everything that is deportation or removal wise is through the court system. And so when you have also a lack of judges in this area, I think there's like over 300 vacancies for immigration judges right now in the United States. There is a backlog of cases for deportation. But it takes affirmatively putting someone through a court proceeding in order to remove them. Now, there are defenses to deportation, and our agency does not do that kind of work because the immigration court the nearest one is in Kansas City, and that's just expends our resources too far. But depending on your circumstances, you may be detained in one of the several facilities we have in the state for detention and detainment. We have some contracts with local county jails where immigrants will wait for their court proceeding in a county jail that has an agreement with ICE. But basically, they have to go through the court system in Kansas City.
A person with temporary residency was denied permanent residency because of a drug matter. Would they be able to apply for extension of their temporary residency when the expiration date rolled along?
That is a great question, and that's one question that I'd have to research based upon the specific details of the drug offense. I have this chart, which I walk through with clients. Again, I'm a visual person, so hopefully that helps my clients too. But this side is, these are the grounds of inadmissibility. So when someone wants to come into the United States, these are the characteristics, traits, behaviors, issues that the U.S. government says if you have some of these, we can not let you in. On the other side, once you're some kind of status, you are then also subject to the grounds of deportability, which is reasons the U.S. government can say, well, now we're going to push you back out. So the grounds of deportability certainly have drug offenses on there. In fact, it has drug abuser and drug addict. So it doesn't even take a conviction, to be honest. There's case law that shows that people were never convicted of any kind of drug offense, but Homeland Security believed that they were drug addicts or drug abusers, probably because of the number of charges maybe put against them or other circumstances that maybe led to that conclusion, but it can cause them to be deportable. I would always recommend when it comes to a specific person's case, it is best advice to go to an immigration attorney, whether that's myself or another provider, who can look at the particular elements of the underlying background, as well as the entry, the exits, any of these grounds of deportability and how they apply, and basically be able to try to give them a better idea of what their options are. But you know, each process is very different, and each case can be very different. Even what we may find acceptable here in Kansas, California may not. So immigration has federal laws, it has state cases, it's got policy memorandums from USCIS and the Department of State. So there's a lot of places that I have to look to figure out what sometimes my client can do.
I think it would be even more complicated now because the way recreational marijuana, for example, is legal in some states. Yes. But are they still going to use the federal?
Well, there is, in certain situations, there are waivers to grounds of inadmissibility and waivers to grounds of deportability. Those waivers can basically overcome then sometimes a petty offense. So there is a petty offense waiver that basically says if it's so much, it's such a minute amount, then we'll just kind of sweep it under the rug. But that doesn't apply in every single situation. So it's one of those cases of a really thorough investigation of the client, a really thorough investigation of the case law that applies, and then the options. Any other questions?
So is there any movement to, in the near future, to try to clean up the immigration programs to where they're understandable and we actually have an immigration program as opposed to a keep out program?
I will say that obviously when it was announced that DACA was ending in September of 2017, there was verbiage that this gives then Congress the ability to make something permanent. That didn't happen. We've seen from history the DREAM Act didn't happen for a number of years. So will there be legislative action that does something to fix this? I do not hold my breath, and I don't have a crystal ball. And I cannot predict. I am living day to day, looking at the latest news and articles, updates on the migrant caravan, and trying to make daily decisions, because that's really, we live in the present. So.
In the meantime, we've added whatever it was, 10,000 agents to the Border Patrol and spending billions of dollars on the wall with no reform.
If you have any more questions, you'll ask Karen. I believe in January is our next lunch and learn. We think it's going to be the Silverhead Legislature, although I'm not sure we've pinned that down yet. But thank you so much for coming.